Hello and welcome. You're watching Race to Power. My name is Mohammed Saleh. And on the show today, we'll be taking a look at the aftermath of this tragic incident involving a passenger jet and a military Black Hawk helicopter in Washington, D.C. And Donald Trump, in the aftermath, has termed the DEI hires to be mentally incompetent. The question, of course, is this: will the DEI hires now be made convenient scapegoats for anything that could go wrong? And in India, with less than 5 days before the assembly elections in India's national capital, New Delhi, the ruling Aam Aadmi Party has suffered a huge setback, with 7 of its sitting electoral representatives quitting the party. But let's start with what is happening in the United States. The world, of course, in a bit of a limbo about President Donald Trump's tariff intentions, as he surprised many by not imposing them straight away, while he had threatened that some tariffs would in fact come in as early as the 1st of February. That seems to be the great unknown at the moment. Now, Trump on Thursday vowed to follow through by his self-imposed 1st of February deadline. However, the president has been known to change his mind. Now, the scope of the duties also remains unclear. More importantly, his strategy of using tariffs as threats for everything has also come into question. Now, some foreign officials, in fact, see the president's threats as a leverage rather than an ironclad commitment to raise import tariffs.
I didn't say that. You said that. No. No. We may or may not. We're going to make that determination probably tonight on oil. Yeah, because they send us oil. We'll see. It depends on what the price is. If the oil is properly priced, if they treat us properly, which they don't. Look, Mexico and Canada have never been good to us on trade. They've treated us very unfairly on trade. And we will be able to make that up very quickly because we don't need the products that they have. We have all the oil you need.
Now, Trump's electoral victory was based on his tariffs plan during the campaign. He surprised many by not imposing them straight away when he took office last week. Now, the president, however, has threatened fresh tariffs in China, Mexico and Canada, but did not actually do so. Instead, Trump directed his team to research the unfair trade practices and to determine if China had fulfilled its 2020 commitments. Now, governments around the world, firms and also investors are in pretty dire need of a plan if the United States were to take a strong protectionist stance, which could disrupt international markets and economy. Now, the impact and tariff uncertainty are also highlighted by the Federal Reserve's chair, Jerome Powell. A Bloomberg report quoting the government sources has shown that Trump's slower than expected rollout of the tariff stems from certain unresolved questions within the new administration. Now, Bloomberg sources said that the Trump team is still debating the fundamentals of the tariff policy, like whether the taxes should be imposed across the board or should they be targeted at certain specific countries and industries, and whether they should be reciprocal. Not only does the administration's economic team lack consensus, but they also lack the key staff members. A majority of Trump's nominees are still awaiting confirmation from the Senate. Still, Bloomberg sources have said that Trump is likely to make good on his promise on Canada and Mexico, with a tariff announcement that could come on the 1st of February. However, both nations would, of course, theoretically have time to negotiate with the White House because the tariffs are unlikely to come into effect for at least about 2 weeks following an announcement. All right, now to give us more details in terms of what, of course, is expected to happen, we are joined by our correspondent Susan Tehrani, who's joining us live from New York at this moment. Susan, this, of course, is the big question, isn't it? Will he or won't he, especially in the context of Canada and Mexico, where he has repeatedly said that Canada and Mexico, the two neighbors of the United States, have never treated the United States fairly on the question of trade. So are we expecting tariffs in the next 24 hours?
That's what Donald Trump has made very clear. It's not just about trade for China. He said that he's very concerned about the issue of fentanyl, the drug that goes, the precursor of fentanyl, goes to Mexico and then enters the United States through the Mexican southern border. And then, of course, for Canada, illegal migration as well as fair trade practices. He plans to impose 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico, as you mentioned, starting Saturday, which is tomorrow. undocumented migration, fentanyl, trade deficits. But it's unclear whether or not he's going to impose these tariffs on oil imports from Canada and Mexico, which may be exempt from tariffs. Now, if he does impose those tariffs on oil, that's when consumers here in the United States and possibly those countries will see prices go up. That's the question right now, whether he'll go that far. Of course, the two countries have said that they're going to impose their own set of tariffs if Donald Trump decides to do this. But it appears that, at least as a negotiating tactic, he might be taking this first step.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Susan Tehrani, for joining us from New York and getting us all those details. We'll, of course, come back to you as this story unfolds in the United States. Meanwhile, in Washington, the authorities are working just round the clock to recover the bodies of those who died in the mid-air collision. The investigation, remember, is still in its early stages, but the tragedy is already embroiled into a huge political slugfest. After the American President Donald Trump addressed a press conference, that these excerpts from a question-answer session in the media is why Trump's comments have kicked up a storm.
Mr. President, you have today blamed the diversity elements, but then told us that you weren't sure that the controllers made any mistake. You then said perhaps the helicopter pilots were the ones who made the mistake.
It's all under investigation.
I understand that. That's why I'm trying to figure out how you can come to the conclusion right now that diversity had something to do with this crash.
Because I have common sense, okay? And unfortunately, a lot of people don't.
All right, so that was Donald Trump's quick rebuttal, saying that he has common sense that a lot of other people don't. Now, Donald Trump, in his lengthy address, blamed the tragedy on hiring that was done under the Diversity and Inclusion Program. Now, to remind our viewers, the investigation, remember, is still underway. No conclusion has been reached yet. But the president has put the blame on the DEI program and the Biden administration for the air crash that took place 2 days ago. Now, Trump's claims are currently completely unsubstantiated, but exercising his presidential powers and furthering his agenda, the Republican president has now signed an aviation order rolling back the federal diversity initiatives. So as Trump signed the order, this is how he's also answered a journalist's question on the question of diversity.
Mr. President, to be clear, are you saying race or gender played a role in this tragedy?
It may have, I don't know. Incompetence might have played a role. We'll let you know that. But we want the most competent people. We don't care what race they are. We want the most competent people, especially in those positions. And you're talking about extremely complex things. And if they don't have a great brain, a great power of the brain, they're not going to be very good at what they do, and bad things will happen.
So as families and Americans mourn the tragedy, the Democrats have criticized the sitting president for making claims without any evidence and targeting certain communities based on gender and race on the question of diversity.
It's one thing for internet pundits to spew off conspiracy theories. It's another for the President of the United States to throw out idle speculation as bodies are still being recovered and families still being notified. It just turns your stomach.
Now, since assuming office, Donald Trump and his administration has launched a scathing attack against federal diversity hiring programs. On his first day, the president signed an executive order cancelling the DEI programs for all federal jobs and pressuring the private sector to follow suit. Now, critics have slammed the move, saying that it further gives rise to systemic racism. But Trump remains pretty steadfast in his pitch on the question of merit and competence. All right, now to give us more perspective on this, we're joined in this broadcast by Ms. Elizabeth Loris, who's a president at the E. Loris Consulting and Professor Emeritus at the University of Mary Washington. She's joining us live on this broadcast. Now, Professor, this of course is a question that I'm pretty sure the Americans will be talking about for many, many months and indeed years to come. Donald Trump, in the aftermath of this very tragic air crash that happened above Washington, D.C., seems to have indicated that the DEI hires are simply incompetent, which may have resulted in this crash, although the investigation is still underway and it is still unsubstantiated to make any of these claims. Does it now mean that anyone who's been hired as part of the DEI programs will now be made a convenient scapegoat if anything were to go wrong in Trump's America?
Well, President Trump certainly ran on a campaign of abolishing DEI programs. That was one of his first executive orders. And in fact, he did sign a very specific executive order. It's titled something like Stop the Madness in DEI in the FAA. So the problem with DEI programs is anyone who, is from a racial minority group, a different, a non-binary sexual orientation, they become suspect that they were hired, for those particular traits rather than for their skills, knowledge, and experience. So it is a rather uncomfortable situation.
And also looking at as to how this will play out in the days to come. Now, Donald Trump is dead against DEI hiring, but how does the American public look at the whole aspect of diversity and empowerment and inclusion? Because this was so important as part of the American civil rights movement to get people of all races and of all diversities to be a part of the American mainstream. Are those gains now going to be lost under Donald Trump?
I don't think the gains will be lost. I mean, remember, Donald Trump was elected by more than 77 million Americans. He not only won the Electoral College, but the popular vote. And this was one of his big campaign issues. So a lot of Americans are on board with getting rid of, the DEI. There were affirmative action programs before this, like DEI agenda came along. Along with the DEI agenda is a lot of administrators and a very large administration at universities, companies, in the government that are pushing what a lot of people see as a political, agenda. On that note, when we're talking about the FAA, it was before the Obama administration, 100% of air traffic controllers were hired through the Collegiate Training Initiative program.
Right.
That was somewhat suspended. And then when DEI programs were initiated, people were qualifying with just high school diplomas if they had the right profile. So, that lends to this criticism of DEI, especially regarding the FAA and air traffic controllers.
Interesting. We'll have to see as to how this, of course, plays out. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Loris, for joining us with that perspective then.
Welcome.
Let's now shift our attention to what is happening in Germany, where Germany is witnessing a wave of anti-immigration protests. Now, 3 weeks before the snap elections will be held in the country, thousands have taken to the streets against the conservative CDU party that is allied with the far-right AfD party on the question of immigration. Now, several cities in Germany witnessed large-scale protests on Thursday night, including rallies in places such as Munich, Berlin and Dusseldorf. The protesters are demonstrating against conservative leader Friedrich Merz and his CDU party for pushing forward a bill on tighter immigration rules with the help of the far-right AfD. Now, the protests began shortly after the lawmakers passed a motion in the parliament to debate the immigration measures. Now, as we speak, the German parliament is in session and lawmakers are debating a bill that contains the provisions for harsher immigration regulation after approval on Thursday. Now, the debate was delayed by 3 hours as the CDU party was scrambling for support from others, including the incumbent Olaf Scholz. However, at the end, the Conservative Party had to rely on the AfD to further its agenda on the proposed overhaul of immigration policies. Now, in the past few months, immigration has, of course, become a critical conversation in Germany and also an important election issue as well. The early elections are scheduled to be held on the 23rd of February after a three-way coalition led by Chancellor Olaf Scholz collapsed in November and lost a no-confidence vote. So it's less than 5 days before the assembly elections in India's national capital, Delhi. The ruling Aam Aadmi Party has suffered a bit of a setback, with 7 of its sitting electoral representatives now quitting the party. Earlier, the Aam Aadmi Party had denied tickets to these MLAs to contest the 5th of February elections, instead choosing to replace them with new candidates. The 7 MLAs who resigned the primary membership of the Aam Aadmi Party on Friday include the likes of the Palam MLA Bhavna Gaur, Kasturba Nagar MLA Madan Lal, Trilokpuri MLA Rohit Mehrolia, Anjana Parcha from the Janakpuri constituency, the MLA Rajesh Rishi, Mehroli's MLA Naresh Yadav, Adarsh Nagar MLA Pawan Sharma and Bijwasan constituency's MLA B.S. June. Meanwhile, the campaign rhetoric in the run-up to the assembly elections continues to centre around the controversy over the Yamuna river waters. On Friday, the former Delhi Chief Minister, Aam Aadmi Party Chief Arvind Kejriwal, gave his reply to the Election Commission that had demanded for factual evidence on his charge that the Haryana government is poisoning the waters of the Yamuna river. Now, Kejriwal, in his reply, questioned the Chief Election Commissioner and claimed that the Commission will be seen working for the ruling party if it did not take any action against the Haryana government and the BJP leaders.
बात ये है, ये आतिशी जी ने, भगवंत मान साहब ने चिट्ठी लिखी चीफ इलेक्शन कमिश्नर को कि ये किया जा रहा है, आप हरियाणा को कहिए कि पानी में अमोनिया ना छोड़े। इलेक्शन कमीशन ने कोई संज्ञान नहीं लिया उसका। ये मिल के आए, इलेक्शन कमीशन ने उस पर कोई ऑर्डर पास नहीं किया हरियाणा सीएम को कि भाई आप पानी ठीक छोड़िए।
Earlier, the Election Commission had asked Kejriwal not to link the rising levels of ammonia in the river with river poisoning, leading the Bharatiya Janata Party to charge against Kejriwal. Now, the Indian Prime Minister also addressed a political rally in the Dwarka locality where he criticised the ruling party.
ये आपदा वाले हरियाणा से नफरत करते हैं, ये तो हम सबको पता है, और अपनी नफरत में ये लगातार नीचे ही गिरते जा रहे हैं। जब दिल्ली में प्रदूषण होता है तो ये हरियाणा के किसानों को गालियां देते हैं।
Now, the Delhi Congress has accused Kejriwal of stopping the work on building master drains along the Yamuna to divert the untreated sewage of the city towards treatment plants in Vrindavan.
Four, 5 years ago, Kejriwal had said, "Don't vote for me if I don't get the Yamuna clean." So he shouldn't be asking for votes now.
All right, let's now turn our attention to Pakistan, where the Pakistani journalists, believe it or not, are continuing with their protests against a new government law that criminalizes what the government terms is online disinformation. The Federal Union of Journalists in Pakistan is observing a black day today against a government bill that amends the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act 2016. Now, the journalists in Pakistan, believe it or not, have taken to the streets. They are staging a sit-in protest in front of the Parliament House, and they're demanding for the repeal of what they've termed is a black law. Now, the journalists held the demonstration across the country wearing black armbands while covering the event. Now, union offices and press clubs have also been draped in black as a symbol of resistance. The Pakistani journalists have called the proposed amendments as a thin ruse to crack down on dissent by the government. The National Assembly reportedly rushed through the legislation with little warning last week before it was approved by the Senate on Tuesday. Now, this legislation lays down the punishment of up to 3 years in prison for anyone who spreads fake news. Now, this proposed law says that anyone who intentionally spreads, displays or transmits false information which intends to cause fear, panic or unrest in the society could face up to 3 years in prison and a fine of over $23,000 or both. Now, the Senate Standing Committee said that the bill primarily seeks to modernize the legislative framework for combating cyber crimes in Pakistan and it does not seek to muzzle the media, as the journalists claim. Now, the Interior Secretary emphasized that the bill is in fact written in good faith, and it aims to protect the general public at large. And WION's Pakistan Bureau Chief Anas Malik has sent us this report from Islamabad. Listen in.
Journalists in Islamabad have been protesting against the draconian legislations under the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, the PICA Act, that have been introduced by the government, which broadly talks about criminalizing quote-unquote fake news without going into the definition of fake news. It also is increasing at stifling dissent, freedom of speech and freedom of press, and largely the journalists all across the country today have been staging protest demonstrations like these in a bid to urge the government to reverse the draconian legislation that have recently been passed, and they have also urged the government to consult the journalists before introducing such legislations. Anas Malik in Islamabad, Pakistan for WION World is One.
The Myanmar's military junta has extended the state of emergency for another 6 months, a move announced just a day before the 4th anniversary of the 2021 coup that overturned the elected government. The decision comes as the country remains in chaos amidst a raging civil war after the military deposed the previous Aung San Suu Kyi's government and took control. For nearly about 4 years, Myanmar has been witnessing a brutal conflict as the junta is facing off against a growing armed rebellion. The junta claims that it is moving forward with plans to hold elections this year. However, critics have called the move a sham that is intended to keep the generals in power through proxies rather than a true democratic process. While no date has been set for the polls, the military shows no signs of backing down either and is pushing ahead with plans to assert control over the country, even as it faces multiple fronts of resistance and continues to struggle with governance. Now, Mexico's Senate has begun a lottery to elect candidates for judges, ministers and magistrates, including members of the Supreme Court. The lottery is part of a new process set to lead the election of hundreds of judges on the 1st of June 2025. The new procedure follows a controversial judiciary reform approved last September under former President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Now, this reform allows for the popular election of judges by a direct vote, a move that's been criticized for politicizing justice and also endangering the rule of law. Now, the lottery follows a court ruling that halted the initial evaluation process, which was based on merit, pushing the Senate to select candidates from over 1,200 aspirants.
I already said it. There's no human power that can stop the election. I will say that there's no legal recourse that can stop the election at this point. The opposition could not, have not and will not be able to. On Sunday, June 1st, 2025, the people of Mexico will generate a milestone in history by being the first people of humanity to elect by universal, secret and direct vote their judges. That's the size of what we're doing.
Now, civil organizations and academics have expressed concerns calling for transparency in the respect of judicial resolutions in the selection process. The judicial overhaul had previously triggered months-long protests in Mexico. And with that's a wrap on this edition of Race to Power. Thanks for watching.
India's Budget 2025 is here. Will it fuel growth or deepen inflation's bite? Will it support the rupee and markets? From tax reforms to middle-class relief, we decode what's in it for you. Stay ahead with our expert analysis and global perspective.
After killing a governor, a military chief, and foreign peacekeepers, the dreaded M23 rebels force advance into Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The United Nations raises alarm. Nigeria's authorities officially declare the Lakurawa armed group that flogs people for listening to music a terrorist organization and bans it across the country. Lakurawa is a new militant group that carries out attacks targeting local communities in northwestern Nigeria and across the border with Niger. And Japanese adventurer Gamp Suzuki arrives in Cape Town at the end of a more than 6,000-kilometer journey across Africa while pulling a rickshaw. That's at these times on World of Africa. On WION, World is One.
This week on Inside South Asia, Afghans who sided with America against the Taliban denied entry to the US under Trump's new immigration order. 6 months